Attention, attention please. Stand by for another episode of
When Humanists Attack.
Hi, this is Chris West with When Humanists Attack, a 501c3 not-for-profit organization and also a podcast. Today we're going to be sitting around and talking, Vincent Downing, Chris West, the Pontificator, with Daniel Mann. We're going to be talking with Daniel about his ideas of the world, his cosmology, his beliefs, and why he believes those things. So I'd like to start off by welcoming Daniel. Daniel, welcome to When Humanists Attack.
Well, thanks. It's nice to be here. Maybe I shouldn't speak too prematurely, but I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Well, we're very pleased that you were willing to take the time to sit down and chat with us. I'd like to know a little bit about your background, your history. Where were you born? What kind of family did you grow up in? And how did you develop as a person towards your current status?
I was the oldest of three sons. I grew up in a Jewish family, and my family was atheistic or agnostic. I was the one who had a much stronger Jewish identification than the other two. And maybe that was because of the anti-Semitism that I experienced. And it affected me so deeply that I dreaded going to school. And it became physical at times too. And I wasn't one who was comfortable about just holding it in. And it just produced such a hatred in me, hatred so intense that I actually thought that they had a different odor. And I grew up in an area that was just white and Jewish. That was it.
And whereabout was this? What part of the country are you from?
This was Clifton, New Jersey. When anti-Semitism was directed towards me, people who I thought were my friends kind of vanished. And so I was left with the opinion that they were all anti-Semitic. And so it became so painfully obvious or conscious on my part that when I was with Jewish people, I would feel one way. When I was with white people, I would feel another way. And finally, this led me to become a Zionist and to move to Israel. And I hated everything Christian because I looked at, this is the way the Jews conceptualize the world. They look at people as either Jew or non-Jew. And so since they had Christmas trees and they would talk about Christian type of stuff, they were Christian in my mind. And so I hated them. And I really felt that the only place that a Jew could live comfortably was in their own homeland in Israel. So I moved there when I was about 23 years old. And I tried out a number of kibbutzim. And these are collectives. And they were very popular in Israel at the time. And I didn't even realize it at the time, but I got involved in kibbutzim that were part of the ultra-Marxist movement. But I wasn't really very conscious of what was going on because I was more into myself and that inner environment than I was in finding the perfect environment. In fact, for me, the perfect environment was where everybody would love me because I felt very unloved growing up. So unloved that I felt that I had to be somebody else to be worthy of someone else's love.
You said that you started getting into Zionism before you went to Israel. Can you tell me a little about that journey?
For me, Zionism was simply a matter of Jewish survival. It was about Jews having their own homeland where people wouldn't try to kill us off. And I read a lot of Jewish history at the time because that's what I identified with. I grew up feeling hated by the world. And it was strange. It wasn't that I probably grew up in an area that was maybe 10% Jewish. And so most of my friends were Jewish. But it's not like we sat around and we talked about anti-Semitism. It was very, very, my identity and talking about anti-Semitism was a very private thing. I never even talked to my parents about it. Maybe it was because it was an area of a shame in my life and a shame to other people also. that we ignored that. We ignored that conversation. And so going to Israel for me represented a matter of being part of my own family where I would be accepted, where I would feel loved and feel like I belonged. But of course, it doesn't work out that way. And it didn't work out for me that way because people are people wherever you go. And it was interesting. It was interesting to be part of kibbutz life. And I experienced 6 different kibbutzim looking for the ideal one, which of course you never find. And in fact, I was, my wife at the time told me that I was a problem wherever I went. And I was oblivious to that. I was oblivious to the fact that I was rubbing people the wrong way. In fact, we went to visit kibbutz where we spent a year back in, I think it was 92, with my daughter. And she was about 20 at the time. And we visited this kibbutz, and I didn't know who these people were, but people knew who I was, and they even knew who my daughter was. And so my relative who drove us there went to the woman who was the head of the volunteers and asked them, what type of person was Daniel? And she said, he was only a problem, just a problem. I had no aware. I knew I had problems with people, but I couldn't understand why.
Can you tell me a little about where your parents fall in that spectrum?
Yeah, my parents, they were both born in the States, but their parents came from Poland. And so they left there very happily, and they experienced a lot of anti-Semitism there also, whether they did anything to bring it on themselves. And sometimes I get critical of my Messianic brethren in that regards. But I don't know, but they didn't have much good to say about it.
Your parents would have been born in America, and that would have meant that your grandparents were part of the Ellis Island crowd.
Yeah, they were. Okay. They came to the States, I guess, one before the World War I, and a couple of them after World War I, and so my parents were born like in the 20s. I was born in 47. And yeah, it did. But, it impacts us in a very, very different way. As I said, I grew up with a very strong Jewish identity. Yeah. I was the one who experienced more anti-Semitism than my brothers. I was the oldest one. And by the time they went through the same school system, they didn't experience the anti-Semitism that I had experienced. And so it was different for them.
Yeah.
And we always had a difference. I mean, I think we're close as brothers. We still are, even though they don't share my faith. But yet we have a very different outlook on life, different reactions to things, as if we didn't grow up in the same household.
And I think that all of us with siblings have that and I think that's something that psychology has borne out. They're going to have 4 people in a room all experiencing the same stimulus and walking away with different experiences. And that really is molded by who we are as people. And that's not really a choice from my experience. It's really what we're born with. And how that's nurtured one way or the other is how well we develop coping mechanisms to deal with our personalities and how they fit with the rest of the world. So you started out in a cultural Jewish environment without a lot of religion around the Judaism. And then you discovered, for self-defense reasons, it seems, that you were interested in finding out more about Zionism. What is your first memory of your interactions with the Bible?
Well, it was in Israel, because it was in Israel that I began to search out God. And my first experience with the Bible, somebody gave me a Bible. It was an Old Testament, and they gave me the Bible. And somehow I stumbled upon the book of Joshua. And I love the book of Joshua. Any idea why I love the book of Joshua? Because in the book of Joshua, us Jews were kicking butt. And I liked it. It made me feel good. But after you're finished with the book of Joshua, you go on to the book of Judges.
Yeah.
And in the book of Judges, it's the Israelites who are getting kicked all over the place. I said, I can't take this any longer. And I put down the Bible. And so my orientation to the Bible was in a very human way. I won't use the word humanistic, but in a very, very human way. I was looking for something to make me feel good about myself because I never did. It was in Israel that I began to search for God. And so whenever I heard of somebody who had a religious faith, what I would do was pursue them and ask them, how do you know this stuff is true? What has it done for your life? And nobody really could give me any satisfactory answers. So I visited a number of Orthodox communities where I could ask them my questions, and I still couldn't get any satisfactory answers. Anything. I identified with them. I appreciated what they were doing, but it didn't seem to really be able to penetrate to the place of my need, to the place of my satisfaction, where I could really feel I'm on the right track. I moved into this commune, which was a big mistake. But they told me, well, the reason that you're going through this stuff is because you're in rebellion against God. And they were very radical. And they believed that everybody had to be living in a commune where they didn't have control over their own life, their own money, and this is what God wanted. And I thought, my gosh, maybe they're right. I can't, I'm dysfunctional, the way I am. I'll give it a try. Well, it didn't work out. It didn't work out at all. But there were times, and I had this little room in the basement, that I would try to pray. And I was so hurting within me, I couldn't even pray. I tried to read the Bible, but I couldn't do that. And if I could only understand. I was so distraught. I could only understand the simplest statements. And so one night, sometimes I would just go to sleep, and I could only sleep like 5 minutes at a time. But I would go to sleep with my Bible just resting on my stomach. And one such night, I was reading the Bible, and I just read a simple phrase. And it just said, and God heard him. And an explosion went off in my mind. It was just a moment of light. I saw light. It just lasted for a moment. But afterwards, the depression was gone, the fear was gone, the panic attacks were gone. It was all gone. And I felt such a joy. I knew that God loved me. Now, the next day was back again. But it left me with something. It left me with the conviction that even though I'm going through this garbage, that God hears me and that he's there for me. And so I married a French woman in the process, and she wanted to leave Israel. I still wanted to stay in Israel. And so she didn't want to go back to France. She was kind of a rebel, and I was sort of a rebel. And we would decided that we would come back to the States and we would live in harmony with nature, because we believed that if you live in harmony with nature, you will experience the peace of nature. And that's what we were both looking for peace. But we weren't getting much peace out of our marriage. Well, there was no peace within me.
Yeah.
And so there was not much peace in my wife either. And so when two people get together with that, carrying all the baggage that we did, it was hard for us to really, I guess, get along. We were both problem people. We both rejected the bourgeoisie, the materialistic lifestyle, and we wanted to live in harmony with nature. And my parents very graciously took us in. But after a week or two, my mother pulled me over for a private conversation and said, you got to get rid of this woman. I can't take her anymore. So I decided I'd get in the car and I would just look for some place to rent, just some little shack on a farm. And we found that down in Virginia. And we were given a piece of land, and I drove a cab to make money. And so we were hoping, though, to have our own farm. And it was at that time that we began to look into the communes. And we visited several, but for some reason, and I don't remember what happened at the time, there was really no connection. So we decided we'd try to find a cheap piece of land, cheap farm somewhere. And we did, way up in the hills. way up in the hills of Appalachia. And it was rough. It was at the end of a dead end road, but we liked the fact that we were living on a on a gravel road at the end of a dead end, and we were all by ourselves there, nobody else in sight, and we were going to live by our own wits and our own elbow grease, and that appealed to both of us. But we didn't anticipate the problems.
I was reading your blog the other day, and I've been reading some of your writings to try to get an understanding of where you're coming from, your points of view. And you mentioned in a recent blog post about the moment where you had a complete change of idea about how the world is put together. You had an aha moment, as many of us would say. Could you bring us through that moment?
Sure, yeah. My wife and child weren't home at the time. I had a horrible chainsaw injury. I was clumsy. The chainsaw bucked back on me. It was before there were any chainsaw guards, and it hit me in the head while I was going. And I lifted my hands up to see if I still had a skull. And when I lifted my hands up, I saw that my wrist had been half cut off, and the blood was squirting out like crazy.
My gosh.
And I was laying in a pool of blood, thinking that my next breath is going to be my last because I was losing so much blood. And suddenly I realized that I wasn't alone. I knew that there was somebody else there with the same degree of certainty that I know that you're here right now, even over Zoom. And I knew it was God. I didn't know who he was. I had been searching for God, but all my attempts to find him were totally aborted. And one reason they were is that I was expecting God to fit into my identity, my agenda, to give me what I needed, and I didn't find anything. But during this encounter with God, while I was laying in this pool of blood, I was filled with such a joy and an ecstasy, knowing that I was beloved by God and nothing else made any difference at all. Even if I died, I knew that this God was going to be there for me, that he loved me, and that he was going to take care of me. And that's all that mattered. And I vowed to God during that time, God, I would gladly give you both arms and both legs just to have you. And I really meant it. When this happened, I was very close to the house. I tucked my hand in the side. I ran in. We had a wall phone. No such thing as 911 back then. I only knew the number of one neighbor. And so with my hand tucked in to try to cut off the bleeding, I called their number, but the phone rang 16, 18 times. And I thought, if they don't pick up, that's the
I'm
end.
done for, right?
That's it. Because I'm going to pass out any moment. And so finally, after maybe 18 rings, and I said the Shema, the Shema, when Jews say before they're going to die, they answered the phone. But I found out later that they had gotten in the car and the son was getting in. He was about probably 14, 15 at the time. And they said, don't get the phone. We got things to do in town. And he said, Dad, just say it's somebody who's hurt, who needs our help. And he ran back and he got the phone. And so when they finally arrived, they saw something that was just horrific because of the blood squirting. The walls were painted with blood. And I was laying down. The woman, fortunately, was a nurse. And she said she had never met anybody closer to death because I had turned gray. I had lost so much blood. And so she wrapped up my hand, my wrist, and she called for the ambulance. But it took about an hour before they can get there because they were riding around here and there. And finally, when they got there, they tried to stick an IV in me, but all my veins had collapsed and they couldn't get anything in. So they just took out the paperwork and they were doing the paperwork. So my neighbors started screaming at them and saying, you better get him to the hospital immediately or you're not going to have anybody to. Now, I was passed out at this time. You're not going to have anybody to fill out this paperwork on.
Yeah.
And so they were shamed.
Yeah.
And so they must have, from the story I heard, they loaded me up and they took me to the hospital. And fortunately, there was a good doctor there at the time who sewed me up. But I was so naive that the next morning, surgeon came in after I woke up, and I was out, until the next morning. And he says, "You're going to have to start moving your hand, because if you don't move your hand, it's going to get locked up." And I kind of sloughed him off, because I felt that this God, whoever he is, I knew that he is all powerful, and I didn't even have to bother with my hand. But as you can see, I can't even make a fist anymore, because it did lock up on me. I didn't do anything with it. I was in a hospital for about 4 days. And during that time, I thought about my vow, and the people who rescued me brought me some books to read, and they were Christian. And I thought, oh my gosh, I had this one fear. And the one fear that I had was this was going to lead me to Jesus. And that was the one place I didn't want to go. But I had made a vow, and I wanted the truth more than anything else. I had to know who this God is who saved me. And that was the overriding concern, even greater than my fear. And so these neighbors brought me some books to read, and they were Christian. And I thought, oh my gosh, this sounds like Jesus who I met. and and so I thought I have to make the next step, and that's after I got home. And so I couldn't go to a church. Now, that would have been too traumatic for me. In fact, I imagined that if I went into a church, I would become so nauseated, I would vomit. That's how intense my hatred was. And so, but I heard of a prayer meeting that was meeting outside of a church. And I thought, well, maybe I can handle this. So I went there, and I came. I was all bandaged. My head was bandaged. My arm was bandaged, and I was only the second person there. And people turned to me. Nobody saw me before. People were coming in. People looked at them. They looked at me to kind of get in some acknowledgement. Like, do any of you know who this guy is? And so finally, one woman turned to me and she says, "Have you ever been here before?" And I said, "Nope." And she turned back to me and she said, "Do you know Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior?" I said, "Look, lady, I didn't come here to talk about myself. When you pray, I'll pray. You want to get up and sing, I'll sing. Whatever you do, I'll do. But I don't, just don't pay no attention to me." And so they just had to proceed. And it was so strange to me. I'd never been in anything like this in my life. People would hold hands and pray, and I was just, with my eyes open, I'd look around at everybody and thought, this is strange. This is like going to a witch's Sabbath or something. That's how strange it felt like. And people would kind of look up and squint their eyes at me, and they see me looking at them, and they quickly put their head down.
Your entire journey through life was trying to find a sense of wholeness that you had been denied as a kid, and being beat up, and trying to find that connection with a community. What rings to me as a question is whether or not the imprint that you would have made on the nameless, formless experience that warmth, that overwhelming feeling, might have been pointed, instead of towards Jesus, towards a different deity.
My search wasn't resolved after a visit to this group or a visit to the home of the people who invited me. It took many, many months, because I needed to know, because I had the same type of doubts. I tend to be the biggest skeptic in the world. I wanted the truth. Now, there were times when it just felt so right to believe that Jesus had died for my sins and God loved me. But then I would think, how can I believe this stuff? It doesn't make any sense to me that God is supposed to be all powerful, and now Jesus has to die in order for God to love me. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I struggled for many, many months. And during this time, I put out what we call a fleece. You might not be familiar with that. But it's like, God, you're going to have to show me. If I'm going in the right direction, I really, really want to know the truth, I really want to find you, you're going to have to confirm it for me. And so I would have to hitchhike from way out in the country, the end of a dead end road, all the way to the hospital to see my surgeon. Because the only vehicle we had was a stick truck. My wife couldn't drive
In
it,
your hand.
and I couldn't.
Right.
And so I would have to hitchhike. I said, one way you can confirm it to me is bring me a number of fantastic rides to get to the hospital. And that's what happened. When I got out in the street, right outside my dead end road, somebody stopped. He didn't open the door. He rolled down the window. You know, he had seen me putting out my thumb. And he says, I don't know why I'm stopping for you. I have never stopped for hitchhikers. I don't know what I'm doing. I just started laughing. and finally, he was just staring at me, and I looked at him, and he just kicked open the door and said, you might as well get in. And so the next ride I got was equally incredible. Maybe not equally, but I put up my thumb. Somebody stopped, and there were a bunch of guys in the car, got in, and we're racing along the highway to the hospital. And he says, I'll drive you right there. I said, oh, cool. And so as we were driving, he got this blowout. The car was in terrible shape, but he got a blowout in the front tire. And going as fast as he was really dangerous, but he was able to hold the road. And finally he said, don't worry about it. I'll drive you there anyway. And with this flat tire, he drove me all the way there. And I thought, oh my gosh.
That sounds certainly kind, and it certainly does sound a bit unusual if we have a pessimistic view of the world. It's about a worldview, right? Why are these things happening is what we're both trying to get behind. Your newer worldview that you had just kind of begun to adopt after this accident fit perfectly into that. The things that are happening is because the conversation that you had with God, and these are the proofs.
I had experienced decades of depression, and then followed by the addition of panic attacks. I had dropped out of college 3 times, you know, trying to find something else. I was gonna be a concert pianist. I was gonna be this, and I was gonna be that. I tried out Judaism. I put on tefillin and on my own said the prescribed prayers, but nothing ever worked. I saw psychotherapists, and they left me worse off than I was before. I tried meditation for a while, but I found that doing meditation and focusing on myself was more depressing than anything else I could imagine. So that never took me anywhere. It seemed that everything that I tried was a dead end. And so this was very different, because even though it was so hard for me to believe it, I really felt that Jesus had died for my sins, even though my mind was rebelling against it. And I had joy in knowing that God loved me, and that he cared about me, and that he rescued me in such a miraculous way, and that he gave me these various signs. And so I began to try out church. And fortunately, I went to a church where people really embraced me. I started to feel so confident that I decided I would go back to college again. And I wanted to help people. And it seemed that when I met people in need, I never knew what to tell them. I never knew how to help them. So I decided I was going to go back to college and get a degree in social work, which I did get. I did a field placement in a community mental health center, and it was an interesting placement for me, because I would get into the sessions with the psychotherapists, and they would talk about their cases and process this problem and that problem. And it gave me an insight into what they were going through, the problems that they encountered. I was beginning to trust in Jesus. And there was a girl in one of my social work classes. I wanted to go up to her, and I wanted to talk to her, but I didn't have the courage. And so I was graduating, and she was graduating at the end of the term. And I prayed to God, and I said, God, I'm a failure, but I'll tell you what I'll do, God. If this woman is standing outside the door When I come out of the bathroom, I thought I was safe here. When I come out of the bathroom, I will speak to her. I opened the door and there she was. And so I said, "You're not going to believe this. I got to talk to you." And I told her the story. I said, "Can I buy you a cup of coffee?" And she said, "Yeah." And I told her about my life and about Jesus. And she says, "My gosh, that's an interesting story." Well, it was the last time I ever saw her. But things would happen like that. Things would happen to confirm to this skeptic that this was for real. It wasn't just a good feeling. It wasn't just a need that I needed a God who would love me, but there was really truth to this. Contrary to my hope, after I came to Christ, the panic attacks came on big time. I was so devastated. I was in a graduate counseling program and I had to drop out. I couldn't even talk. I was in such pain. I couldn't even talk to people. I felt so ashamed of myself, so ashamed of my faith. Whenever I was walking on the street and I saw somebody coming towards me that I know, I'd find an alley to duck down so I wouldn't have to talk to anybody. I was suffering so that I felt that God didn't like me. Okay, maybe he would take me to be into heaven with him, but just reluctantly, because my whole life had been a life of rejection.
Yeah.
And so it was hard for me to really feel that God had accepted me, especially in light of my depression and the panic attacks. I was in church one evening, and once a month they would have a special service where the people would come up to the podium and talk about what God did for them. And when I would hear that, I would be so distraught within me, and I would think, what has God done for me? I'm struggling. Anybody has a better life than me. And so I didn't want to call attention to myself, but I couldn't stand it any longer. I was going to get up and leave. And I heard a voice, and it's the only time I ever heard a voice like that. I'm not in the habit of hearing voices. I heard a voice, and all the voice said was, "Just wait a minute." It was kind of like a voice within me. It wasn't an external voice. And I thought, okay, I can wait a minute or two. And as I waited, somebody came up behind me and threw their arms around me in a loving embrace. And when I turned around to see who it was, there was nobody there. And I knew immediately that it must have been God proving that he loved me, even though my situation was so painful. Now, of course, being the skeptic that I am, the next day, I'd pinch myself and I'd ask myself, how can you believe this stuff? How can you believe that God actually came up behind you and hugged you? But I knew what happened. I knew what I experienced. I knew what I was sure of. And even though my doubts kicked in, I had to tell my doubts, get out of here, because I know what I experienced. It was kind of as if God was telling me, okay, I brought you this far. Now get up on your feet and start walking. You don't need these miracles anymore. Because after that, I never had any. But I needed those miracles to keep me going from one day to the next.
This is Chris West from When Humanists Attack, and that is all for tonight.